What sets off your internal alarm system? You know that feeling where the hairs on the back of your neck are standing up, your stomach begins feeling queasy, and everything about your insides start feeling like they are going to explode? Maybe it's a phone call that comes at a certain time of day or night or from a certain number. Maybe it's when a colleague or your boss steps into your cubicle or sends you a message that says, I want to see you. Maybe it's when a spouse says, we need to talk. For me, I have a few, but one of those are these words: God told me. Why? Stay tuned.
If your desire is to become spiritually stronger, emotionally healthier, and relationally smarter, you're at the right place. Speaker and writer Stephanie Smith inspires and equips you to achieve these three key aims. If you're a parent, you'll also learn how to raise empowered kids, ready for adulthood. Let's get started.
Welcome back, my friend. I'm so delighted that you are here. Hey, if you don't know, the Thursday episodes that come out on this podcast they're the same title, but they have a different focus, and they are specifically for parents and educators and mentors to be able to help the upcoming generation in the same key areas that we focus on here on the Tuesday episodes. That we can build up generations who are spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart. What a difference it would make in the lives of individuals and in communities and in our nation and our world if we had young people who didn't have to sort all that stuff out when they were in their 30s or 40s or 50s, and some people that never do. But what about if we had children who walked into adulthood already spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart, understanding there's some things that you only learn and grow and develop as you go through life, but also with the awareness and the skill set of how to be that kind of a person throughout their life. And that is part of what Life's Key 3 podcast is really all about. And that is what everything that I do here at Stephanie Presents is about, whether it's speaking, writing, podcasting, whatever it's about. So if you don't know that, make sure that you tune in for those episodes. And maybe you're saying, you know what, my parenting days are done, or I'm not a parent. I don't know that I'm ever going to be a parent. It's okay, because I bet you have some people in your life who are parents. And my guess is that you may still have impact either on parents or educators, or you may be in a situation where you have direct impact on children and youth, whether they are grandkids or maybe they are nieces, nephews, maybe they are kids that you disciple in your church or as an educator dealing with students in a classroom. So make sure, if you don't already know about that, make sure to check out those episodes and then share them with other individuals as well. Well, going back to what we've been covering here, we've been walking through the book of Nehemiah. That's a book in the Old Testament. It's a short book, but it's a fascinating book, especially on looking at leadership. And I don't just mean leadership in the terms of thinking at the C-suite level, but leadership of ourselves as individuals, leaders in our homes, leaders in our communities, in our churches, and in our jobs, and in every other respect. So whatever positions you hold, I hope that you will have a mindset of leadership. Don't just think that leadership is tied to position, because leadership is primarily about mindset. There are plenty of people, unfortunately, that occupy positions of leadership who don't have a leadership mindset, and they end up causing the rest of us to have to pay for that. But sometimes, even if a person doesn't occupy a position of leadership, their mindset of leadership still has a tremendous impact. Plus, you know what? You never know someday when your positions are going to change. And if you already have cultivated a leadership mindset, you're going to be able to step into those positions with authority, with excellence, with grace, and with effectiveness. One of the reasons it is imperative for us to develop the skills and the mindset of leadership, again, regardless of the positions that we currently hold, is because by default, leaders will look out for themselves. That doesn't mean that's what everybody does. I'm not jumping on that bandwagon of saying just because a person holds a position of leadership, well, they're just in it for themselves. I think that the more that we perpetuate that mindset, especially when it comes to political offices, well, that's the more of the type of people that we end up with. But by default, that is what history shows us is going to happen. And that's what we see that's been happening here in the book of Nehemiah. And specifically today, what I want to talk about is I'm going to follow up a little bit more in depth about what I raised in last week's podcast episode, last Tuesday's episode on Nehemiah chapter 5, the first part of that chapter, and looking at that in terms of today and what we would call church hurt. In the opening of the podcast, I said, some of the scariest words that I can hear that will definitely cause my internal alarm system to set off, like flashing lights, sirens, the whole thing going off, are the words God told me. Why is that? Well, it's because I know what it is to experience what we might call church hurt, or we might even call spiritual abuse. I know that personally. It's not just something I've studied or I've read about or heard other people. I know what that is. And I've had more than one experience of that in my life. I do believe that God has ways of communicating with us as individuals in ways that are distinct to us. And I'm not going to say that God never can reveal something that is divine knowledge to an individual. Scripture makes it very clear that he can and that he does. It's not the guiding principle for how we're supposed to expect all of life to operate. But that doesn't mean that there aren't times that God does do that. So it's not a matter of having a theology that says no one could ever have any kind of what we might call divine or special knowledge from God about themselves or about someone else. But because of my experience, I am incredibly slow to just swallow that because somebody says, well, God told me. That doesn't make me go, oh, let me lean in and listen. And because I'm just going to swallow that, it really kind of makes me take a couple of steps back and look at you and go, okay, well, let's hear what he said. And then I'm going to see, number one, does that align with Scripture? If it doesn't align with Scripture, it's out. That's done. Don't need to give it any more thought. It goes in the trash. But some things aren't that cut and dried. And it might be something, well, it could align, but maybe it doesn't. So then what do we do with that? Well, that's where, again, going back to some of my very early podcast episodes where I talked about the core compass of truth. And so just like we have north, south, east, and west, and those four directions allow us to get anywhere in this world. I mean, we have to have all four of those coordinates. In the same way, I think that the way that we look at truth is we have a north, south, east, and west. And north is Scripture. That doesn't move. That doesn't change. Just like the North Star, which actually, interestingly, just in case you don't know this, is a collection of 3 stars, and they don't move. And that is what allows navigation to even be possible, because there is a fixed point. But also we have south, west, and east. And in the same way, we also have common sense. I mean, this is a universal grace that God has given to us. And this doesn't mean that we treat our common sense like the North Star, because common sense can vary from culture to culture and over time. What seems to be common sense in one culture can be very different from common sense in another culture. However, that doesn't mean that we throw all of it out entirely. And sometimes common sense is we tend to discard it, not because it's so different among different groups of people, but because it's so blatantly obvious and it's so simple. It's like the story of the little boy, the emperor's new clothes, and everybody who wants to be so sophisticated is just ignoring what their common sense tells them is right in front of them, which was the emperor has no clothes. But this child who wasn't interested in being sophisticated, he was interested in just being a reasonable, rational human being. He was just being himself, and he could look and go, hey, yeah, the emperor has no clothes. And in the same way, there are some things that are just basic common sense, but when we want to become so sophisticated, we end up ignoring that. And there's a whole lot of that going on in our culture right now. I'm not going to get into all of that on today's podcast episode. Secondly, in addition to common sense, is we have other people. God does reveal truth to individuals, and this might be through science and through people who make scientific explorations and discoveries, and they find out how molecules work, and they find out how cells work, and they learn about all of these different things. They learn how an ecological system works in a certain part of the world. And this is because God is gracious and generous. He doesn't just share this knowledge and wisdom with people who believe in him. He's generous to the point of sharing this knowledge and wisdom with people that don't even believe he exists at all. And then the other point that we have is we have creation. There are so many different things that creation itself shows to us. And I'm not just talking about things that we often associate with like the geological layers of the earth and trying to figure out the age of the earth and all that. I mean, just the fact that the earth has and the universe has order to it is an indication that there is a sort of intelligence behind it, because intelligence is what creates order. Chaos results from what we recognize would be a lack of intelligence behind it, which sometimes I can attest to, because that might be what the state of my kitchen counter looks like. And I'm like, okay, definitely have not been intelligent here. And that is why the chaos has resulted. But I digress. Back to Nehemiah and church hurt. As I said, I've had personal experience with this. And many years ago, I was in a situation, it was a very, very incredibly vulnerable time in my life. And I had a person who held a position of leadership in a spiritual institution. This person did not know me. I wasn't their student. They did not mentor me. They had an incredibly brief encounter with me one time. And from that encounter, they then summoned me some days later, and they opened their conversation by saying that they had been praying and God had told them, and they went on. And what they said that God had told them was about me was devastating. And had I been a more emotionally healthy, relationally smart, spiritually strong person at the time, I would have recognized that that was a reflection on them and how they were really not qualified to be in that leadership position that they had. But I wasn't, and I took it to heart, and it set into motion a lot of things in my life that ended up bringing a tremendous amount of hurt and really redirected the course of my life, and not in a positive way. I understand what it is to have a person in a position of leadership in a spiritual and what we would call a Christian institution, who abuses their power and exploits and manipulates people, because I've experienced that for myself, and I know how devastating that it can be. And while I would like to say, well, that's all over, we've learned the lessons of history, clearly we have not. And just as we look back at Nehemiah and we see that here are the Jewish people in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, and they themselves as a people group are in this position where they are incredibly vulnerable. They're ruled by a foreign power. They are surrounded by other nations who are also ruled by this foreign power, but these foreign nations who are also their enemies. And you would think that of all the times that people would come together and look out for each other, it would be in situations like this. That is exactly not what happens. What does happen is the people in power amongst the Jewish people who are the leaders of the Jews, okay? They exploit and abuse and take advantage of their Jewish brothers and sisters. And this had just become the way things were. It didn't just start happening when Nehemiah shows up on the scene. It was an embedded part of their culture. It was systemic. We hear about systemic racism in our country. We hear about systemic issues in other areas. Bad behaviors can absolutely become systemic. And it was systemic in this time and in this area that the leaders were exploiting people and not using their positions of power and leadership and wealth for the betterment of other people, but rather to take advantage of them. One of the problems when we become an outcome-based culture, which we're very close to having become that with just a few pockets that aren't, instead of a values-driven culture, is we weigh whether we should or shouldn't do something based on whether we're going to get the outcome we want, not because it's the right thing to do. As a former history teacher and someone who still loves history, I know that there were so many individuals who fought for the abolition of slavery here in the United States. You had African Americans as well as whites who fought for the abolition of that, not because they calculated the odds and they said, we think that we're going to be able to get this eradicated, but because it was simply the right thing to do. Many people who spent their lives fighting this, I don't mean just being individually opposed to it. I mean, people who lost their positions, people who were physically attacked, people who had their homes and their businesses ransacked or destroyed or burnt down, and who got up and who kept fighting for the abolition of slavery and never, ever saw it change. In their lifetime, they never saw the outcome change. As a matter of fact, at different points in history, they just saw the process get even worse. Why did they continue? Because they had a conviction it was the right thing to do, because they had a moral code that was externally founded. It wasn't internal to them. You see, other people in the country had a moral code that was internal to them and said slavery is just fine. This is actually one of the benefits of Christianity, is it gives us a moral code that is external to us. In the same way, the people here in Nehemiah, we see something similar. Not the same way at the level of slavery. I don't want to compare those two things, but I do in the sense of the impact of the individuals. But in the same way that we have people who can say, hey, this system works for us, and other people over here saying, it doesn't work for us at all. Just as slavery worked for a lot of people in the United States. I mean, there were plenty of people who said there's nothing wrong with this, and it worked for a certain segment of the population, which is why it was around for so long. But those were people who, even though they could claim all they wanted to about, going back to Scripture never condoned slavery as it was practiced here in the United States, not even close to that. When you have a proper understanding and the thoroughness of Scripture, there's just absolutely clear as day that it never, ever supported the kind of slavery that was here in the United States. And in a similar way, you have people who said here in Nehemiah's time, it's just fine what we're doing with these people. It's fine for us to be able to put this heavy tax on them, to require that they mortgage their properties and go into debt, and we're going to charge them all this interest just so they can survive while we are building wealth more and more and more for ourselves. They were going by their own internal value system rather than relying on the external moral code and value system that God has given to us. This is a little bit of an aside, but I'm just going to point this out. For people who say there is no external source of truth, that everybody just has their own individual truth, you can discount that, actually, not discount that. You can prove that's wrong just very fast. You know what you can do? You can just say, okay, could you please give me your debit card and tell me what your PIN number is? And they're not going to do that right away, and they're probably not going to do that at all because they're going to be, hey, wait a minute, but well, hey, my truth is that I should have your stuff. So, if I have my truth and your truth is, no, I don't think so. This isn't yours to take. Well, then how do you decide what's true and what's right? And then the whole value of Christianity is that we have this external moral code that God has given to us. And when people align with that as individuals and as a group of people, then they will experience life closer to what it was designed to be. Now, we're never going to experience life fully for what it was designed to be as long as we are living on this earth in its unredeemed state. But it will certainly be better than if we choose to not align ourselves at all with how God has said, this is the way that you're supposed to operate, and this is the way that life is supposed to go. And these leaders in Nehemiah's time certainly were not aligning themselves with how God has said leaders are supposed to operate. What do we do then when we have been or are currently in the middle of a situation where the people who are in our areas of life that are exercising leadership, how do we respond when they have done something or are continuing to do something that is harmful to us? Last week I shared about 4 ways that Nehemiah dealt with this, and we definitely need to look at that and apply those. But I also understand that we're not always going to be in a position similar to Nehemiah's where we have the opportunity to do those 4 steps that I talked about last week. So as an individual, how do we respond to that? And I want to share a couple of ideas with you about that today. The first, I would say, is do what the people did here in Nehemiah. Speak up until the situation changes. Just as there were people who fought against slavery here in the United States until it changed. So there are things that can seem like they've gone on for so long. They are embedded to such a degree we don't even see hope or an opportunity or the possibility of change. That cannot be what drives us to make the decisions we do. We don't speak up. Again, we're not speaking up against things because we think that we're going to get a certain outcome. We speak up because it's the right thing to do, and we keep doing it, and we keep doing it until the situation changes. And at an individual level, let's say that you are dealing with this right now in your local church. And so you have a specific institution and you are watching this happen. You may continue to speak up, and you may come to a point of recognizing you cannot stay in that church. You can continue to speak up, not in a vengeful way, but you can continue to speak up until that situation changes. And it may be that you need to stay there until it does, and it may be that you need to leave because there is a certain point at which we say, we've done all that we can do here. It's time for us to move on. But you can still keep speaking up about in a broad way about what is appropriate leadership and what is not. One of the mistakes we don't want to make, and I've heard this many times in my life, and I think it's not just sad, it's dangerous. And it's this idea that people have taken where they've taken one scripture and they've taken it out of context and they've not put it in the context of the rest of scripture. And it's like, well, God's put that person in leadership, so They never really quite finished the so, what comes after that. It's clear throughout Scripture. Every person that is in a position of leadership is not because God divinely put them there. God gives us the freedom to make real decisions in this life and then to live with those decisions. And when I hear that, I always want to ask a question. So define leadership. I mean, does that mean that every school board member across the United States that's been elected into that role, that God divinely put them there? I don't think though. I don't think that's so. So where do we draw the line as to what qualifies as leadership and what doesn't? I think rather that we would be better served and we would serve others better if we saw that we have a responsibility to become leaders ourselves and then to look at who we vote or however it happens, hire to put people in positions of leadership, and that God doesn't become our excuse for poor leadership. The other thing that I think that a person does when they're in this situation or they've been in a situation maybe in the past and they're still working through it, of what we would call church hurt, is to distinguish between individuals and institutions. Now, I've been using the phrase church hurt throughout this podcast episode, but the reality is no one can say, I've been hurt by the church. We can only say, I've been hurt by these individuals, because all institutional hurt happens at an individual level. You know, Nehemiah was a leader who was in a position that he could have exploited and abused the people. And it would have been easy for the leaders that were there that were also exploiting and abusing people to think that, oh, he's just going to behave the same as we are, or to at least not confront them about their choices. And it also would have been easy for the people being exploited to assume that he was just going to behave like the leadership currently was, and that their suffering didn't matter to him. Fortunately, the people decided that, and they distinguished between individuals and institutions, and they took their problems to Nehemiah. I'm sure that they had been taking their problems to their leaders before. It wasn't like the leaders were hearing for the first time, hey, we have a problem here. But the people distinguished between the individuals there. And they said, Nehemiah, yes, he's a leader up here, but he's different. And so we're going to continue to bring our issues forward. We're going to keep speaking up until we see change. And as we deal with these things in our own lives, we need to distinguish when we say things like the church, what we're really talking about is every other Christian on the planet. And I can't say, well, I've been hurt by every other Christian on the planet. So we need to be careful that when we talk about church hurt, we talk about spiritual abuse, that we go back to take the ownership that there were these individuals. It's a lot easier to talk in these big, vague, broad categories, because then we don't have to look at the individual impact of that, and we don't have to deal with the person or the persons that were involved, and we can just make it this big, broad, fuzzy, kind of blob, I guess. But in a way, what that does is it kind of lets us off the hook of how we're going to respond to it. The third thing that we need to distinguish is between harm and hurt. There is a difference there. Hurt is something that I don't like, and it might offend me. It might be something that challenges me. It might be something I don't agree with. It might even be like unkind. But there is a difference between hurt and harm. And in a culture where we are increasingly coming to what we're increasingly seeing in generations is an expectation that of an entitlement mentality that we get to go through life without ever being hurt, which good luck with that, then we do want to be careful that we distinguish between what's hurtful and what's truly harmful. Another principle that we can see here in Nehemiah is that we choose to rebuild trust when there is a reason to. Forgiveness is not trust. Forgiveness is not the reduction or removal of consequences. When we say that God forgives us, we can say that not because the penalty of sin was waived, but because it was paid. God didn't waive the consequences for our choices that were wrong. He paid for those through the death and resurrection and the sinless life of Jesus Christ. Trust follows behavior, it doesn't precede it. Another thing, if we're honest, we have to do is to resist the desire or the pull for revenge. And this is where we just have to be courageously honest to say, yes, it's human nature to want to hurt back people who've hurt us. Having that desire or having that inclination doesn't make us a horrible person. It makes us a human being. But whether we act on that or not is the key there. And lastly, I would say this: choose to let your response define you, not the event or the events. Base your identity on who you are and who you're going to be and who you're going to become, not on what someone else has done or not done. At a practical level, if you find yourself thinking more about someone else's behavior than your own, you start replaying more in your own mind, what they did and what they said and all of this kind of stuff, that's an indication you're not taking ownership for yourself. Absolutely, there is a need to mentally and emotionally process through all of that. And I'm not going to get into how we flesh all of that out in our individual lives. But there is a difference between I'm just rehashing something and it's not going anywhere, and I'm processing something in order that I can move on with my life. And a very practical tool that you can use here is to get a timer. Pull out your phone or get another timer. And when your mind starts to want to replay that hurt and what that person said and what they did, set the timer, not for like 24 hours, for like maybe 5 or 10 minutes, and give yourself permission that you can rehash that all you want during that time. But when that timer goes off, you have to have a plan that's going to engage you mentally and emotionally in something else. If you don't have a definite plan and you don't have a process in order to be able to heal from genuine harm that occurs and has occurred from other Christians, then by default, your identity will become more what's happened to you rather than your response to it. And you don't want that to occur. Again, I know this from personal experience. I know what I'm talking about here. I've had to live this out in my own life more than once. And I just want to encourage you, if you have been in a situation or you're in a situation right now and you are hurting deeply because other Christians have really, truly done you harm. They have let you down. They've exploited you. They have abused you. They have betrayed you. Know this: just because somebody wears a label doesn't make that true about them. And just because somebody is a Christian and in terms of their spiritual standing before God, that does not make them a mature person. Just because somebody's in a position doesn't mean they're qualified and called to be there. Bad people have been in positions of leadership. Irresponsible, selfish people have been in positions of leadership within the church for a long, long time. This isn't new. We see this here happening in the book of Nehemiah. And even though these specifically were not said to be the priests, these were still people who had responsibilities here before God and were leaders, and that were misusing their position to abuse and exploit their fellow Jews. And at a time when it was the worst possible time that ever should have been going on. But know this: healing is possible. Recovery is possible. You don't have to stay in those situations. And I don't just mean physically, but you don't have to stay in those situations mentally and emotionally. Use whatever has happened to you in order to become spiritually stronger, more emotionally healthy, and more relationally smart for yourself and for others. That's one of the reasons that I do what I do as a speaker, as a writer, in my messages and through this podcast, through other things that I do and I'm working on. My hope is, and my prayer is, that everything that I have experienced in my life would be used for God's glory. And that means taking not just knowledge, but it means taking experience and using that to help other people. All right, my friend, that's going to wrap us up here for today. Hey, if you are not with me on social media, I invite you to come and join me. You can find me on Instagram and Facebook at Stephanie Smith Presents. Again, Stephanie Smith Presents. And always go to the website. There are links right there on the website to my Facebook page as well as my Instagram account. Come join me over there, and I'd like to see you over there. And make sure to also, again, for Thursday episode, come back. We're going to be talking about this issue as it comes to kids and how do we help our kids to experience or help them to deal with their feelings or experiences of being let down and disappointed by other individuals who are in positions of authority. All right. If you haven't already, make sure to go to the website, sign up for High Impact, a weekly newsletter filled with all kinds of good stuff for you. And remember this, my friend, you have an impact that is immeasurable, eternal, and irreplaceable. See you next time.
Thank you for listening. Visit the website, stephaniepresents.com, and sign up for High Impact to join the mission of building spiritually strong, emotionally healthy, and relationally smart women and families. You can also book Stephanie to speak at your event and check out additional resources. Together, we can invite and equip generations to engage fully in God's grand story.